close case for the Constitution adapted for the 21st century. He's also a research fellow heading up the Rediscovery Project at the Public Policy Institute at William Jessup University. At this time, I'd like to bring him in with a round of applause, Joshua Charles.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was not aware I'd be meeting one of my heroes today. Thank you all for having me here, Flint Hills Tea Party, judges. Where's Chris? Okay, she's being busy, but thank you to Chris and Chuck and the ones that really made this possible. This is a great event. I tweeted about it, I Facebooked about it, I got a ton of responses to it. I think the next goal is to take this thing national. I don't know about you guys. So anyway, just to open with a joke, Churchill is one of my heroes, Winston Churchill, and he was once asked about a man named Clement Attlee. Clement Attlee was from the other party, and he was the deputy prime minister during the war. It was a national government, Labour Party, Conservative Party together, and somebody once asked Churchill, what did he think of Mr. Attlee? And I'm not going to try and do his voice, but he said, Attlee, a humble man with much to be humble about. And so whether I am a humble man or not, I guess God will decide, but I certainly do have much to be humble about. The things that were just mentioned were great blessings for me, and if you knew the whole story, you'd be pretty blown away by it, but we don't have time for that at the moment. I wanted to focus on something that's not usually mentioned when you talk about the Constitution. I am someone who, well, first of all, thank you for not giving me too much of a hard time for the KU Association. I was born and raised in California and graduated from KU, so how I came out respecting the Constitution is still a miracle for me. I was at Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, in mid-November last year. And fortunately, I have a friend who helped them raise tens of millions of dollars, so I got a little special tour. And one of the things I got to do, they have his tomb. It's a marble tomb of him and Martha, and it's in a family tomb, and it's behind iron bars. By the way, let Chuck tell me how much time he needs. Chuck's doing some nice calligraphy, so. And one of the things we got to do, they opened up the iron bars, which they don't do for regular tourists, and we got to do a wreath laying ceremony at his tomb. And one thing I got to do after that was I kneeled down at his tomb. He's one of my heroes. And I prayed that the Lord would raise up leaders like him for today. And it was a profoundly moving experience. Again, that's why I'm so privileged to be in your presence, sir. Apparently God took me literally. But one thing about George Washington, actually let me back up a little bit. One thing that they just had acquired when I was there, they had all the laws that Congress passed in 1789, all of them. So the very first Congress. And at the front was the Constitution, and that was the copy of the Constitution Washington used for his own personal copy. So we got to see some of his notes in there and him marking out his responsibilities. It was quite extraordinary. But just so you know, the book for all of the laws that Congress passed in 1789 was slightly thicker than this. Just so you're aware. Now, one thing that I love about Washington so much, when you look at his career objectively, he wasn't a particularly good military commander. He wasn't a particularly good politician. He wasn't any of those things. But what he was a man of character and virtue. He stood for something. And just let's do a brief 30-second overview of world history. I think the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century noted that life is nasty, brutish, and short. And that has basically been world history for the vast majority of people. And world history is something I study intently, and it is something that all of us, even those of us who love the Constitution, who love this country, who believe in what it's about, we need to realize something really, really, really singular, unique, and unprecedented happened in 1776. Never before in history. The only other parallel I can think of would maybe be ancient Israel. Maybe. There has been no other country in the history of the world where the people of that country have been able to choose a form of government for themselves and for their children. Ever. Even France, a modern Western democracy, has gone through, 5 republics, 2 governments since 1945, a fascist regime, and obviously during World War II, 2 empires, Napoleonic, and then one later on in the 19th century. That's France. That's not us. We have lived under the same constitution since 1789, and we need to step back and recognize in the broad scope of world history, Egypt, Rome, China, Persian Empire, all of it, nowhere has the people been able to choose for themselves the government that they will live under. Ever. And if it's lost here, I truly believe it's lost. Now, where are we now? 2 incidents. One was more public, one was more private. I'll do the private one first. On that trip to DC I recently had, I had 2 experiences which were very, very close to each other. I was at the National Archives building. I don't know about you guys, but whenever I go to DC, I would much rather see the National Archives than even the monuments, as glorious as they are, because you get to look at the Declaration of Independence, the actual one, the actual Constitution, the actual Bill of Rights. And the first time I saw it, I actually teared up a bit. It's really quite extraordinary. But one thing that the 2 experiences I had, there was a exhibit where they had, right next to the Declaration, I think it was a draft of a speech Abraham Lincoln was writing where he was saying, this nation cannot remain half slave and half free indefinitely. It will end up being one or the other. And I happened to be reading it, and I looked to my left, and there was a black teenager. And it was just an absolutely wonderful moment. I looked at him, I said, do you realize what we're reading? And he looked down at it. And he realized what it was, and so did I, and it was just a wonderful moment. Now, it was quickly followed up by a not so wonderful moment. I was by the Constitution. There was a small group of teenage girls, they were about maybe 15, 16, maybe a little older, and they were asking the security guard, who, they all know a fair amount about this stuff. They said, what's the difference between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? If, after a decade or more of public education, you do not know, this is not meant to put them down, it's simply seeing where we actually are. You do not know the difference between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Our public education system is failing by leaps and bounds. I don't want claps for that. It's just the nature, it's the truth. Now, the more public event was this Georgetown law professor. I don't know if you guys saw this. He was saying, we should just give up the Constitution. I can't snap, so it's just be done with it. Start over. And he gave many reasons. Among them, the founders were white slave owners, which is hardly true, just to put that out there. That it was also old-fashioned. Old-fashioned. And I've talked with several people like this, and I asked them, the one question they could never answer, and which really makes them go back into the shell they should stay in, is what is or are some principles that informed how the Constitution was put together that applied then but do not apply today? We have separation of powers. Why? Well, because power too much here and too much. You got to say, okay, has that changed? No. We have enumerated powers. We have federalism to again prevent power to have the. No. Well, then what's old-fashioned about it? And usually there's a long, well, for them, awkward silence. For me, victorious. But I mean, we could go on and on about this, but it ends up being an incredibly amazing exercise in being accurate at missing the point. Everybody who says the Constitution is old-fashioned, everyone who says it was found by white men, it's usually white men who are saying this, incidentally. It's such a betrayal of everything this country is supposed to be about. Now, going on to the education portion with our kids, well, not my kids. Well, I was about to say I'm not old enough to have kids. Clearly I am, but I don't have them yet. But C.S. Lewis once said, he said, education of the mind without education of the heart serves only to make man a more clever devil. And so what I want to briefly talk about, how's Chuck doing on those checks? Someone tell me? Okay. What I want to talk with you, all of you guys, about is character. I'm 24 years old. I graduated high school about 6 years ago. Trust me, you're really not that far from where I am right now. And talk with your parents. I'm not even that far from where they are either. It just goes by so fast. We really need character and morality built back into who we're making as people. This isn't just a public education. People ask me all the time, what can I do to help improve the situation? Here's one thing that we can first do. Get out of your idea, out of your head, the idea that if you can't change the world, the whole world, you might as well not do anything. Every single one of us can do something. I was involved, I was one of the founding fathers of a Christian fraternity at KU. Admittedly, KU probably needs it a little bit more than K-State, but that being aside, it really brought a lot of things to the fore. And one thing I know is that, speaking for young men, a lot of young men are living their lives for things that are not really meaningful. They're not really meaningful. And a lot of the times it's because they haven't been mentored. They haven't been discipled. They haven't had an older man come alongside them. Okay? I'm going to connect this to the Constitution, I assure you. Which brings to mind a letter that John Adams wrote to his son. You know, most of it's about the weather, school, whatever. There's this one line from it. This is in the 1780s, before the Constitution was even around. He said, "But above all else, my son, watch your character, for the least stain upon it will do you more harm than all of your accomplishments will do you good."
Absolutely.
Is anything even close to that being taught today? In the majority of places. Unfortunately not. Sam Adams, John's cousin, used to say, "If knowledge and virtue are diffused among the people, they shall never be enslaved." Notice that there are two of those, knowledge and virtue. Virtue. Morality. Doing the right thing. Okay? And that's a whole other speech. But that's what I basically want to talk about just briefly. George Washington himself talked about that a free society cannot exist in a state of licentiousness. Licentiousness is a general term from the 18th century that generally refers to immorality, but specifically sexual immorality. I'm not going to go into that, but you can look at the state of our society on multiple fronts and see if he was indeed correct. Now, when we look at the Constitution, the one thing I want you all to remember is let's not kid ourselves that by remembering a whole bunch of details about the Constitution, by default our country is going to turn around. It's not the case. The exercise of self-government is what needs to be brought back. And that cannot happen unless it is first done at the individual level. Now, two practical ways that I would suggest for all of you is parenting and mentoring. Now, if your kids are here, you're probably a pretty darn good parent as it is. But in terms of saying, what can I do, what can I do? If you're a parent, raise them up in the admonition of the Lord. Teach them history. Teach them about this thing. Teach them moral values. Teach them about doing the right thing even when it's hard. Okay? Mentorship. This is huge. This is huge. If you're, I'll speak specifically to young men. I'm not a young girl, so I can't speak as much to that. But young men, get mentors. Older men in here, if you're pastors, if you're community leaders, if you're professors, if you're teachers, mentor young men. Trust me, they need it. The basis of my political views go beyond the Constitution. In fact, they are, in my opinion, what the Constitution is meant to protect. One of my great passions is to see when young people have that fire in their eyes, when they first know why they were put on this earth, when they figure out what their purpose in life is. That's one of my great passions. Because only at that moment does life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness begin to mean something. That's it. If you're just going through life not living for anything, what does that mean to you? What does it mean? It doesn't really mean anything. So If any of you know the famous William Wilberforce, I'd like to share something that he wrote about this. This is what he said. He was the man, in case for any of you who don't know, he was a British politician who almost single-handedly ended the slave trade in the British Empire, which at the time was easily the biggest slave trade. It was the most powerful nation in the world. This is what he said, and for all of us. We have, every one of us, a work to accomplish, wherein our eternal interests are at stake, a work to which we are naturally indisposed. We live in a world abounding with objects which distract our attention and divert our endeavors, and a deadly enemy is ever at hand to seduce and beguile us. If we persevere, indeed, success is certain, but our efforts must know no remission. There is a call on us for vigorous and continual resolution, self-denial, and activity. And so what I'm essentially arguing to you is what Wilberforce argued, that this country, as much as we need people who are more knowledgeable about the Constitution, that's an absolutely essential and necessary step. But perhaps even more essentially, we need people who are willing to lay down their life for the service of their country. I don't mean necessarily militarily. I mean in the legal field, in the media field, in the church field, in the education field, all these areas. I'm not going to spout off cliches about a life given away serving others is more worth it, but it really is. People of integrity, people who will do the right thing no matter what. This is one thing that George